So the message that I want to share with you this morning is actually one that's several months in the making. And it's the title that God has shared with me to share with you is, whose mountain are you on? Whose mountain are you on? Have you ever had a time in your life, an experience where you felt completely helpless? Just completely helpless. Physically, emotionally, spiritually. There was nothing there. You could do nothing. In February of this past year, my wife and family were up at Snowshoe Mountain, and we have started to learn to ski in our 40s, which is what we call a mistake. And so, like most physicians, even though I have left my patients geographically, it is very hard for me to separate from them emotionally. And so what I would do when the wife and the kids would go off to the village to do some shopping or grab some Starbucks is I'd open up the laptop and access work remotely, because we can do those sorts of things, just to check on the patients that had come through while I was gone. So I had done well. I had made it 2 days. It was Saturday, and I had gone 2 days without checking, so I was very proud of myself. So I had fired everything up just to take a peek back at what had gone on a couple days before. And as I started to sort of glance through the notes, one particular note struck my eye. And this was a very special family to me who had just had a newborn, and Amelia was now about 6 weeks old. And they call her Millie June, affectionately. And I had taken care of her and her older sister, Callie, for her whole life. And I was very close to this family. And so I got concerned to open up the chart and started to read. And she had been vomiting. The nurse prac that had seen her had become very nervous about her condition. She was so concerned, in fact, that she sent her over to the emergency room to be evaluated. And for me, as it is, I know with a lot of my colleagues, these are not their children, they're my children too. These are my sons and my daughters, and I take it very personally when my kids, my patients, are sick. And so immediately I began to dive into the notes. I'm pulling up the records, and because I needed to know, how did this story progress? How was this story with my patient going to end? Because at this point, on Saturday, on Snowshoe Mountain, I'm helpless. Dr. McGuffin can't do a thing. But one thing I've noticed is that God has a habit of allowing us to feel helpless in order to reach us and in order to teach us when our focus gets a little off track, where we need to rely on Him and our purposes for His life. And I think He uses this strategy of helpless so that He can be helpful. And you think back, I mean, surely Adam must have felt a little helpless trying to hide naked in a garden. And surely Cain must have felt a little helpless when God rejected his offerings. And surely Moses felt a little helpless. Surely Noah felt a little helpless floating around for 150 days. And then there's an Abram and Abraham who surely felt helpless many times, being driven down to Egypt because of famine, having to lie multiple times about his wife, being his sister, when Pharaoh caught him, when he had his issues with Lot, bartering with God for Sodom and Gomorrah. His wife told him to kick Hagar and Ishmael out of the house. Helpless, completely helpless. And so while all of these experiences surely meet the mark for hopelessness, I don't think any of them really could have prepared Abraham for the mountain. And so we find Abraham in Beersheba. He's now what I will call old, in the hundreds. It's a safe number. And we get to chapter 22 of Genesis. And it says in verse 1, sometime later, God tested Abraham as if he hadn't already had enough in his life. He said to him, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Because in that day, of course, God spoke directly to some of his people. And God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. And that, my friends, is what we call foreshadowing. And note the syntax in that command. He did not say, take your son Isaac to the region of Moriah. He's going to drive it in a little bit further. Take your son, your only son, whom you love. What could this mean? What was Abraham thinking? Well, it's a road trip. I've been on those before. I've been in Ur and Haran to Damascus, and Damascus to Shechem, and Shechem to Bethel, and Bethel to Egypt. He's done some road trips. God's taken me on a road trip. But immediately, God takes him to the mountain. Sacrifice him there, a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. Say what? You want me to do what? Where? God brings the mountain to Abraham. And immediately, as you read this scripture, you're wondering, what happens next? How is this story going to end? So as I scoured the notes of Amelia's chart, and I watched helplessly as this story unfolded, and I'm pulling up her lab results, and I'm looking at the x-rays that they had looked at, and my mind was just starting to flood with my own diagnoses, my own thoughts. Have you ever felt helpless? And I said, oh my gosh, I bet she's got that. No, wait, maybe she's got that. And I began to shout into the screen in this room by myself in Snowshoe Mountain for these doctors to check certain things, to recognize the pain, to recognize the helplessness that was in this child's body. But all my suggestions simply echoed off the walls of this little room in Snowshoe Mountain. Because I'm not the beginning and the end. I am not the Alpha. I am not the Omega. And then the worst possible scenario for me appeared on that computer screen. They were sending her home. And I'm thinking, how can you send her home? How can you do that? Look at the labs, look at the x-ray, hear the story, look at all this stuff. How could you possibly discharge her from the emergency department? I felt completely helpless. Millie June and her precious 6-week-old body were climbing up a very steep mountain, a dangerous mountain. Have you ever felt helpless? Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac, and when he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. Without questioning, without complaint, at least none that are recorded, Abraham simply obeyed God's commands. And what is even more amazing, while some of us may be able to sort of have heard that command and maybe tucked it away, buried it for a few hours, surely after a while most of us would have come to our senses and realized God has made a mistake. He said it's not what he really meant. There is no legitimacy to this. I've got to figure out what was supposed to happen. Surely I was not supposed to go on this steep climb. So on the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance, and he said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." On the third day, 3 days, he had 3 days to stress and to fret and to jump up and down and to complain and to argue. He'd done it before. He and God were on arguing terms. They were close. But why not now? What was holding Abraham back? And I think it's because at this point, Abraham had begun to understand the significance of the mountain. And so there I was, continuing to yell at my computer screen, "You can't send her home. Something bad is going to happen." And I couldn't call him. All of this had already passed. I'm a full day late. All I could do was read on. And so I saw the next note. They had indeed brought her back early that next morning because, as I feared, she had gotten sicker. She had continued to vomit. She had continued to grow weaker. And the new doctor that saw her recognized absolutely and that she needed to transfer to an emergency center. See, Amelia was born with a condition where her intestines did not sit right in the gut. And as a result of that, when they're not rotated the way they're supposed to, in the first year of life, there is a very, very high risk. Those intestines can actually twist on each other. They can twist. And the problem with that is that you've got blood vessels that trail right along with your gut. And once you cut off the blood supply, once you cut off the life-giving blood, then you've cut off the oxygen, the breath of life. And slowly, over time, the cells, the tissues, the organs, the body will begin to die. And so I kept reading, and of course, they were handing her off the last note to somebody else to speed her away in an ambulance to another center, where I predicted that they would be placing her on a table to undergo the scalpel and its sharp blade. Have you ever felt helpless? And you can't even imagine what these parents and their parents are going through. My own misery compared to what they were going through, of course, would be absolutely nothing. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the two of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father, "Father." "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and the wood are here, but where's the lamb for the burnt offering?" And Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering." And the two of them went on together, and when they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. And so as I read that last note, this last handoff note, I began to argue and yell at God. How could you allow me to be gone The one day I needed to be there. Weeks and months will pass in a pediatrician's office where you have well visits and happy kids, maybe an ear infection, maybe a snotty nose. But God, you know, this only happens once, twice, terrible year for us, maybe 3 times when somebody comes in and they need me, the healer. That's why you put me through med school. That's why you allowed me to do residence. That's why you trained me to do these things for this particular moment. This was my time to make a difference in this child's life. And while I do wholeheartedly encourage you to share your deepest and most raw thoughts with God, I must warn you that He will reply back. He has that tendency. And so when I finished my helpless tantrum in this little room on Snowshoe Mountain, I was answered very quickly by the Spirit of God. And He said to me in my inmost parts, "Whose mountain are you on? Whose mountain are you on? Was it not I who brought the ark with Noah and his family to the mountains of Ararat? Was it not I who brought Moses to the top of Mount Sinai to receive my commandments? Was it not I who brought Moses to the top of Mount Pisgah to survey the promised land? Was it not I who burned up the water and the wood and the sacrifice and the stone in the presence of Elijah and the Baals on the top of Mount Carmel? Was it not I who brought Abraham and his son Isaac to Mount Moriah? Was it not I who took the formless and the deep and the dark and brought the light and the expanse and the dry ground from which rose my mountains?" Have you ever felt helpless? And so as I took all of that in and searched my spirit to understand all that God was reminding me of, I pulled up my contact information for Millie and her family, and I began to communicate with Mom. And thus began our journey together. And so day after day, week after week, I followed Millie and her family's journey through multiple surgeries, removal of bowel, infections, many touch and go moments, praise reports followed quickly by prayer requests, all of these valleys, all of these mountains, and all of this being chronicled by her grandfather, himself a pastor. In the darkest moments, mother, father, grandfather praised and worshiped this God, the God who brings the light, the Holy One, the one who provides all blessings. And even these tiny, minute parts of her improvement, her heart rate was not as high, her blood pressure was better, things that we wouldn't even think a thing about day in and day out. A smile. She was able to tolerate a little bit of food. These were day-to-day, hanging on a thread moments for this poor family. And day after day, the hand of Dr. McGuffin, nope, not my hand, it's God's hand. And He had chosen to use other doctors and other nurses and other healthcare professionals to help heal Millie June. Have you ever felt helpless? Good. Good. Because it's God knocking at the door of your heart. It's God's way of reminding you that you need Him and not the other way around. Yes, He will use you in mighty ways in His own time, but His thoughts are higher than our thoughts. His ways are higher than ours. His voice is the one that calms the waves and the wind. He's the one that heals the blind and the lame and the sick. He heals in His own time. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him, from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on that boy. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." God set out to test Abraham, and so he did, to the point of imminent sacrifice of his son. The scripture does not ever indicate that Abraham ever fought God's directive, only that he followed it. This morning I wanted to share with you how God places us in positions of helplessness to ensure that we will remain fully reliant on Him. In our weakness, His power is made strong. I had nothing to do with the diagnosis and treatment and eventual healing of Millie June. I was helpless, and that is exactly where God wanted me to be. It wasn't about me, it wasn't about my actions. It was about me humbling myself and learning that I did what I could do, which was to pray for her and pray for her family, and take on my role as His child and let the great physician do his job. And do what He did. He did not allow a hand to take away Millie June. 105 days later, 105 days later, Millie June came home, and she was healed, and she was back in church with her family. Praise to God who helps the helpless.